We will end our programming tonight with a final series of Imagining the Future, Resetting Our Financial World, moderated by the CEO of Dynamic Planet, Kristin Rechberger.
As we kick off this final session, Resetting Our Financial World, we have 4 experts to share their perspectives. First, Rose New, Chief Conservation Officer of the Paulson Institute, will tell us about the economic value of nature. This important work relates to the UN Convention on Biodiversity, or CBD. The next CBD conference will be held next year. Countries of the world come together to agree on how to better protect, manage, and finance nature in the next decade. The Paulson Institute and partners will release a report in July outlining important recommendations. Welcome, Rose. Can you hear me, Rose?
Thank you, Kristin. We already know that. Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can.
Hello?
I just wanted to ask you a...
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question. Yes. Yeah. So, Rose, It's been a perfect storm of climate change, biodiversity loss, and now COVID-19. Going forward, can we integrate economic solutions by also investing in biodiversity?
Yes. We already know that COVID-19 has caused the largest global economic disruption since the Great Depression, even greater than the financial crisis of 2008. We are also facing unprecedented climate and biodiversity crisis, even though they are not immediately front and center right now. In fact, they present even more serious risk to human prosperity. In the last 50 years, since the first Earth Day, we are losing nature at an alarming rate. Some people might say, okay, that's sad, but does it matter? The answer is yes. The nature is fundamental to our survival, from clean air, clean water, food, and medicine. The service provided by nature underpin all economic activity and human well-being. Today, we are only beginning to understand the true value of nature. For example, the capital value of pollinating insects alone is estimated to be $14 trillion US, and at least a third of all medicine come from natural sources.
Did you say $14 trillion in value just from pollinating insects, such as for our food?
Yes. And this is still a lot. There is still a lot we don't know about the consequences of biodiversity loss. Therefore, we must enhance global biodiversity protection. It's like an insurance policy against many of the unforeseeable risks. The major reason for losing our biodiversity so fast is a lack of understanding and a lack of integration of the value of nature into economic decision-making. The benefit of nature are largely public goods and knowledge, which are externalities in the economic sense. So we cannot rely on market forces to solve the problem of biodiversity loss. Policy intervention is essential. As governments around the world design and implement stimulus plans to kickstart the economies, they cannot focus only on the short-term necessity to restart a business-as-usual economy. They need to integrate biodiversity conservation into those plans.
Rose, can you share some findings and recommendations from your upcoming report?
Yes, our report responds directly to global biodiversity loss in economic and financial terms. The report focuses on 4 key elements. First, present a strong economic case for why governments and other actors should take immediate action to invest in biodiversity. Second, estimate the funding flows, project needs and gaps of global biodiversity conservation. Third, identify the key public and private policy, financing mechanisms, and enabling conditions required to close the financing gap. Lastly, develop specific financing targets and implementation mechanisms for consideration at the CBD conference.
Thank you. Your chair, Hank Paulson, recently wrote a great op-ed on the 7 principles for a post-coronavirus recovery. The environment was one. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Given Hank's experience of guiding the U.S. response to the financial crisis of 2008, Hank fully understands the economic pressure faced by governments right now. He also has a strong sense of the serious environment and public health risk facing the international community. Hank always says, a thriving economy is dependent on a healthy environment. Successfully addressing the climate change and biodiversity crisis will depend on collaborations by all major countries, particularly between China and the United States, the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. We know that collaboration can be politically difficult at times, but politicians must have the strength and leadership to make it happen, because that collaboration is firmly in our mutual interest.
Can we touch on the origination of this pandemic, the fact that the coronavirus jumped from wildlife to humans? What's the key lesson we should learn, Rose?
It's an important step that Chinese government has cracked down on wet markets. They will also revise the wildlife protection law to ban the wildlife trade in the near future. The key for them is to enforce those policies. Obviously, this pandemic is a wake-up call about the reality of the risk we face and how they are linked to our relationship with nature. As we count the cost of this pandemic, both in terms of human life and our economy, we must learn lessons. At the same time, we must realize that we have ignored the much larger risks posed by climate change and biodiversity loss. The upcoming CBD conference is an opportunity for the international community to work together and make the right policies. As the countries start to rebuild the economies after this global crisis, it reminds us how interlinked we are and how important nature is to the economy. We must remember that environment and economy are two sides of the same coin.
And environment and economy are certainly two sides of the same coin. Thank you so much, Rose. Next, we have David Antonioli, the CEO of Verra. Bye, Rose. Is David with us?
I should be with you.
Hi, David. Thanks for joining us, David. David is CEO of Verra. David, carbon offsets have received a lot of attention lately. Verra has been involved in carbon markets for a long time. Can you please tell us about Verra's role and the status of the carbon market?
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. So Verra is a nonprofit organization, and we sit in a very unique position at the center, really at the confluence of finance and climate action. And we do that by serving as a regulator. Traditionally, that's been in what's called the voluntary carbon market, and it means that we manage and set rules and requirements around what qualifies as a real project that can generate carbon offsets. We manage the Verified Carbon Standard Program, or the VCS program, which is the largest greenhouse gas credit program in the voluntary carbon market in the world.
Some would say that offsets don't really solve the root problem. What's your response to that?
Well, they do not solve the root problem, but that's because they're not meant to do so. So offsets are really meant to compensate what you would call residual emissions that you cannot avoid. So, they're really meant to complement more comprehensive and deeper actions to address climate change. Let me give you an analogy. When you brush your teeth at night, you get rid of most of the stuff in your mouth, but you don't get rid of everything. But there comes flossing, right? So just like flossing, carbon offsetting can serve to complement and really kind of clean up the rest of the mess. And unfortunately, the reality is that no matter what we do, we're going to have residual emissions, and that's where offsetting comes in. And it's important to note one thing, that offsetting is getting a lot of attention because it is very effective at doing what it's meant to do, meaning it's reducing emissions. And that's because there are rigorous rules around offsets. They're audited by independent third parties. The information is all publicly available on websites, and they're managed by nonprofits. It's not a profit-driven thing. So they're very effective at what they do, but they're not meant to solve the problem. And it's important that we understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, a lot of companies are making big carbon announcements lately. Like Microsoft, for example, wants to be carbon negative by 2030, which means they have to offset, reduce, and invest in things like nature-based solutions, reforestation, or keeping wetlands in place. Why are some companies doing this now?
Well, I think they're seeing the risks behind not taking any action, and they're seeing opportunities to really be leaders. So kudos to Microsoft for taking that commitment and making all that happen. They're doing, I believe, what they can to reduce their own emissions, and they're offsetting what they can. And they're also investing in other new technologies that might help us solve the problem. But this really kind of is a all hands on deck kind of a problem where we need all of the solutions. At the same time, my guess is that Microsoft is making a bet or understands that at some point, consumers are going to be asking, where were you when this was a looming crisis? Were you doing the right thing? Were you taking action? And were you being responsible with your emissions?
The big companies represent the demand side of the carbon market. Let's move to the supply side. Can you give a couple of carbon offset project examples and how that financing has helped nature and communities in that place?
Sure, absolutely. There's quite a few. We've registered more than 1,500 projects, so there's quite a few to talk about. But I'll talk about two that do two things. One, they address climate, so they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, but they're also generating a lot of sustainable development benefits. The first project is in Indonesia. It's called the Rimba Raya project. It took 91,000 of natural, tropical virgin forest and prevented it from becoming a palm oil plantation. And that area is now becoming a reserve for orangutans to be reintroduced to the wild. At the same time, the project is providing technical and business support to people in the communities to provide for food production ventures. So that enhances food security, increases income, and does a lot of good, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In a separate, different project in Kenya, the TIS project, it's paying farmers money for planting and growing trees. They're working with more than 90,000 farmers in Kenya alone. And, the farmers have responsibility for growing the trees and measuring and reporting all the carbon that they've sequestered, but that they can also do what they want with the revenues. One woman, for example, built a school and now has a side business running a school for local children. An interesting feature about this particular project is really interesting. They have a rule that in the smaller farmer groups that they organize between 50 and 80 people, You can't repeat being a leader until every adult that's eligible to become a leader has played a role, has become a leader, has been a leader in the group. So it means that people who've traditionally not typically been leaders, they've been able to step up. And of course, women, you can imagine, are now taking leadership roles in their communities and doing a fantastic job. So these are just two examples of projects that are doing a tremendous amount of good, both to address the climate problem, but also to provide sustainable development benefits to communities and people.
Very cool. What can we as individuals do to reduce our carbon footprints?
Well, I think that it takes us back to the flossing example, right? I think we can do some fundamental changes. We can put solar panels on our roof. We can commit to buying renewable electricity. We can fly a lot less. We can eat less meat. There's a number of things we can do, and we should be doing. We also can offset what we can't avoid, right? But I think the question is interesting because we've got to make sure that ultimately it's not, I mean, we need to do things, but also our governments need to do things too. And they need to lead the process to ensure that we have systemic change from the ground up. And that means electing leaders who believe in climate change. So that's a really important part. What we can do is, let's say, vote for people who care about climate change.
Great. And during this time of turbulence, David, what are you optimistic about?
I'd say three things. The first relates to my last point, that I think climate change is becoming a real serious issue, a hot topic, and will drive much of the debate in upcoming election cycles, whether in the US or around the world. We're seeing a massive movement with Greta and a lot of real attention and focus on this issue. I'm hopeful that we'll have real governments who are very committed to taking on serious action on this real big problem that's a looming crisis. I think the second thing relates to the Paris Agreement, which is the mechanism or the framework we've all agreed to address climate change. And one of the interesting parts about the Paris Agreement is that it enables countries to step up and have greater ambition. So if we have politicians who care about climate change, when they come to realizing or submitting, their targets in the future, those will be more stringent. And I hope, and I'm optimistic about the fact that we'll be able to, see increased ambition. And finally, I'm heartened by, the actions that people are taking already, and that some of the corporates that we've seen, you mentioned Microsoft just a few days ago, Delta made a terrific announcement about how they're doubling down on their sustainability commitment, even in the face of this massive crisis that's certainly making an impact on their bottom line. So I'm hopeful that people will not lose sight of the real one of the very important issues of our time, and that we need to get on top of it.
Thanks so much for joining us, David. Next, we have Kathy Baughman McLeod, Director of the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation at the Atlantic Council. Is Kathy with us? Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Kathy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Kathy, we know that human and planetary health are inextricably linked. When it comes to resilience, what is the coronavirus teaching us?
I think it's teaching us the power of social connectedness. It's showing us the human spirit of generosity and care. Research tells us that the closer we are to our neighbors and the more socially connected we are, the more likely we are to survive a disaster, natural or otherwise. And so when we see the stories of people supporting each other through this crisis and the way that we're innovating through it, the stories are just remarkable. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, people are turning to nature to get outside and try to understand what this means and to heal from this crisis.
You previously worked at a global commercial bank as head of environmental and social risk. What are the chances of us building in more environmental criteria for risk in our markets after this?
I think there's a big opportunity that's going to present itself, even in the face of this long and dark recovery. And there's a top down and a bottom up movement happening. And the top down is, and that movement means that we will be better reflecting the value of a healthy environment in our financial system. And so there's the regulatory environment for big banks and big corporations, and it's slowly recognizing the costs of harming people and the environment. If you think about your 401k or your retirement fund, there's some bit in there that is hurting people and hurting the environment. And so we know it's not sustainable. And ideally, we want everyone to follow the same rules. And business loves certainty. But that takes time. But on the other hand is the social movement. It's just moving that, the consumer choice and voice is moving like wildfire. And Jim Cramer, who's the host of CNBC's Mad Money, said recently that financial managers of young investors, they know that their clients don't want fossil fuels in their portfolio. And he likened the oil companies to the tobacco companies of the 1980s. And he cited movements of divestment and pushes for institutional investors to divest of oil and gas. And so what that means is that social license to operate has eroded. And the recovery is a big chance to accelerate that change that reflects environment in our financial system. And it will certainly help to have more women and people of color in leadership positions in the financial world.
What type of resilience have you seen in your work that could inform the future?
Well, if you think about resilient people and communities and small business and supply chains and companies, they they make the market more resilient. And we know that the market is not a it may seem like it, but it's not a faceless, nameless thing. It's human behavior. It's a collection of people making decisions. And sometimes those decisions are better than others. And good decisions can lead to good outcomes. And one example is the evidence that resilience planning and practice works. And the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, recently told a story about the city of New Orleans needing to build a 2,000 bed hospital for coronavirus patients. And because they knew each other, because they had a resilient strategy they built as a part of the 100 Resilient Cities program that Rockefeller created, the Rockefeller Foundation, and because they'd been through Hurricane Katrina, they knew what to do. They knew who did what, and they had that muscle built. And so that muscle, we need to build it and keep it strong. And we will need it, we need it now and we'll need it in the future.
Hmm. You had a great piece in Foreign Policy recently. What kind of climate actions can communities take now?
Well, there are some really tried and true things. We talk a lot about innovation, but some of the things that we can do to reduce our risks of climate change are simple. Lighter surfaces like lighter rooftops and sidewalks and streets that reflect light and heat instead of absorb it and then emanate it at night. And many nature based solutions, not surprising, again, pocket gardens and rooftop gardens. They feed people and cool the air and store water. And we're seeing evidence of those gardens. Long-time program in Quito, Ecuador, where thousands of families, particularly led by women, have changed their economic futures with these gardens. And we're working with the city of Chennai on rooftop gardens in India. And so these are as simple as trees cooling neighborhoods and absorbing pollution. And we know nature is our superhero.
Hmm. And what advice do you have for us as we build our own personal resilience towards a better future?
It's simple. Know your risk. What are your risks and what reduces those risks? Think about think about where your house is, think about where you live, think about your health, think about your finances. Just understanding, even trying to quantify what those risks are, that's a good start to building your own resilience. And in terms of being optimistic, I would say we have what we need to reframe and rebuild the financial world as we come out of this crisis. We've learned a lot. We're different coming out. We have the policy, we have the money, we have the innovation. We just need to pour all that positive energy and the social capital that we've built, pour it into fighting the virus, but also pour it into building a more sustainable financial system, a more sustainable world, and of course, make every day Earth Day.
Thank you so much for being with us, Kathy.
Thank you.
To end our Earth Optimism Summit, we have Steve Case, one of America's best known and most accomplished entrepreneurs. He's a pioneer of the internet by founding America Online and is now a major investor in other entrepreneurs through Revolution, Roger the Rest Fund, and the Case Foundation. Welcome, Steve.
Great to be with you, Kristin.
Steve, given the pandemic, what trends are you seeing and thinking about as we imagine the world in the next phase?
Well, for starters, the trend is we're all working from home and connecting digitally, like with this digital summit. So it forces some changes in habits, but it also gives us a different kind of perspective. It's particularly interesting for me because, as you know, we started America Online AOL in 1985. So 35 years ago, only 3% of people were online, and they're only online an hour a week. And so the fact that we now have a global summit online with about 100 speakers from all around the country, indeed all around the world, shows we've made a lot of progress. That's great to see. I think the other area that gives us a platform to come together, talk about solutions, and collaborate to try to put those solutions in play. Another area I'm quite optimistic about is business is increasingly recognizing they have a broader purpose. They need to have an impact, and particularly as we shift from the second wave of the internet to what I've called the third wave of the internet, that really creates an opportunity to really innovate in some of the most important aspects of our lives and get more people on the playing field focused on trying to solve these problems and recognize some might look at it just in the context of a problem, but a better way, which obviously what the summit is all about, is also looking at it from the prism of an opportunity.
Very cool. So it sounds like you're optimistic about what's going to come out of this.
Yeah, very optimistic. And this is partly because we've learned in everything we've done that has had significant impact. It's not about what any one person does. It's how you drive collaboration. How do you drive a sense of possibility, create a sense of momentum, and get people working together in ways that they might not have imagined in the past. And that's the key to any change, any movement, and any significant activity. And that's why this summit has been so important, to really use this digital. Obviously, it wasn't intended to be a digital summit. We were intending to have it be a in-person physical summit. But because it had to shift to being digital, we actually are able to reach more people in more places than we could if we did have it just in Washington, D.C. So I think it's been a great opportunity to have people talk about a whole variety of different issues, to put some specific programs in place, actions in place, and try to mobilize all of us to do more to try to really, in an optimistic way, move forward.
Thank you, Steve, and previously to Rose, David, and Kathy, too, and all of you watching. As you've heard in the last couple of days, our policy and markets can include nature in a much more representative and valued way. And while we're in a tough moment, we're optimistic that we can address our converging crises of COVID-19, climate change, and biodiversity loss to reboot our economies with best science, innovation, entrepreneurship, public engagement, and ambitious policies, which will ensure resilience and sustainability. So now, as the chair of the Smithsonian Board of Regents, Steve will close our awe-inspiring couple days. Over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you, Kristin. Again, thank you, everybody who's has made this possible. Certainly the leadership, Nancy and Ruth and the whole team that really envisioned this Earth Optimism Summit and worked together for a long period of time, bringing a lot of partners to bear to make it possible. The whole idea, as you all know, is how do we shift this dialogue from being around doom and gloom to being much more around opportunity and optimism. That's what I think our world needs, and we need to do it together. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the great proverbs, African proverbs I love is the one that says, if you want to go quickly, you can go alone. But if you want to go far, you must go together. We need to go far in the area of the future of the Earth and climate change. We can't do that alone. We must do that together. Hopefully, this very difficult virus we're dealing with, this crisis we're dealing with, both a health crisis and now an economic crisis, has been a little bit of a wake-up call, kind of perhaps forced us to take a step back and pause a little bit, reflect on where we are, where we've come from, but more importantly on where we're going to go. And hopefully people will come together in an optimistic way to solve these problems. The Smithsonian is certainly proud to be hosting this summit. Lonnie Bunch, our secretary, kicked off the summit. I'm honored to be able to close it because it's not just an important issue to the Smithsonian, it's also a great example, as Lonnie talked about, of where we want to move the Smithsonian, which of course we love the 19 museums and the zoo and the research organizations we have in this country and other parts of the world. But we recognize it's not just about what we can do physically. It is like this, what we can do digitally. How do we reach more people in more places? What Lonnie's called the virtual Smithsonian. How do we reach 1 billion people? Far more than can ever get on a plane, fly to Washington, D.C., walk around the mall to visit where most of our physical museums are. So this Earth Optimism Summit is critically important in terms of driving that virtual Smithsonian idea forward. And it's also critically important in driving the idea of one Smithsonian. How do we bring the Smithsonian together in a more united, collaborative way, both the different parts of the Smithsonian and partnering with other organizations, just as we've done with this summit. So I'm so proud of the Smithsonian, so proud of the team that has put on this Earth Optimism Summit. It's a critical moment in our world that we really need to figure out ways to come together, collaborate in different ways, be optimistic, seize the opportunity. And the Smithsonian has been honored to be the host of this. Hopefully, the next time we convene the Earth Optimism Summit, we will be able to have more of a physical presence to it, not just a digital presence. But this has been a terrific couple of days. I've watched much of the programming. And I just want to thank everybody who took the time to be part of it, to be a speaker, everybody who's taken the time to listen, everybody who's been working behind the scenes for a long period of time to make this possible. And in the final word, I just urge everybody to reflect on what they've heard, what they've learned over the past couple of days, and figure out 1 or 2 things that they can do to take action, to not just be thinking about it, but doing something about it, and particularly doing it with others, doing it together, building on that African proverb. How do we work together, collaborate together to create a better world, a more inclusive world, a safer world, a healthier world, and an optimistic world. So thank you all for being part of the Earth Optimism Summit. We're very proud to be hosting it. Hope to see you all soon. Until then, stay safe.